East Texas in the late 1930s was a world of deep, silent shadows. The Great Depression had been officially declared. Its cold breath was already seeping through the piney woods, withering the hopes of farmers who worked the stubborn red clay soil. Small towns like Hillsborough, Gladewater, and Longview were pockets of flickering electric light surrounded by an ocean of primordial darkness. And from this darkness and desperation, the Barrow Gang was born. The leader of this Texas gang, Clyde Barrow, a man whose spirit felt as tough as the land itself, was a natural predator, with eyes that held no light and a reputation for violence that preceded him like a bad smell. He found his perfect instruments in Raymond and Maybelle Hamilton. Raymond was all raw nerve and boiling resentment, a man who believed the world owed him more than a life of back-breaking labor. Maybelle, his sister, was the more complex and, in many ways, the more terrifying figure. Where Raymond was hot-headed, Maybelle had a cold, calculating resolve. She had an intense loyalty to her brother, almost to the point of obsession, and a tough demeanor that let her face horrors without flinching. They were joined by Abe Boone Miller, Clyde's less intelligent but equally vicious brother. Their covenant had shared understanding that they would take what they wanted, and that any pushback would be met with such brutal force that it would crush any thoughts of resistance completely. They gathered in the shacks and abandoned farmhouses that dotted the landscape, and their plans whispered over jars of moonshine. The gang's crime spree was not a series of simple robberies. It was a harvest of fear. They specialized in what became known as lightwood, not justice, a term that would forever after carry a sinister connotation. They would descend upon isolated farmhouses under the cover of night, and their arrival was sudden and absolute, much like wolves breaking into a sheepfold. They would deliver a paralyzing initial blow to the victim, which was swift and meant to disorient and terrify their target. Then came the interrogation, a ritual of pain that became their gruesome signature. The fireplace was the centerpiece of their torture. They would stoke the embers until the fire could turn a metal object to glow with a white-hot heat. They would then take a fire poker or a length of metal object and heat it in until the end glowed a blistering cherry red. The most infamous example was their attack on the farmer Pemberton. They dragged the man from his bed, tied him to a chair, and demanded his life savings. When he pleaded poverty, Clyde simply nodded to Raymond Hamilton. The hiss of the hot iron meeting Pemberton's flesh was followed by a scream that tore through the silent night. They applied the iron to his chest, his back, the soles of his feet. When he lost consciousness, they turned to his wife and children, holding the glowing metal inches from their faces. The smell was not just of burning flesh, but of utter human degradation. Mr. Pemberton died from his injuries. This method was repeated with variations. An elderly woman, Geneva Granny Hardy, was reportedly tortured with a hot iron screwdriver for the few dollars she had hidden in a coffee can. Another couple, Watson and Annie Davidson, were found murdered in their home, their bodies bearing the unmistakable charred marks of the gang's passage. The gang moved through the various surrounding counties like a fever dream, leaving behind not just stolen valuables, but shattered minds and scorched skin. The darkness of the East Texas woods was no longer just empty. It was filled with the specter of the hot iron torture and death. The end of the spree began with greed. On a cool April night in 1936, the gang holed up in an overgrown cabin near Longview, counting their spoils and planning their next atrocity. But a tip born from the growing paranoia of a community reached the sheriff. A posse of farmers and shopkeepers was formed, men whose families slept nervously behind locked doors. People surrounded the gang's cabin, their shotguns and rifles pointing at the single lit window. What followed was not a heroic gunfight, but a brutal, close-range slaughter. When the door was thrown open, Clyde Barrow emerged, firing wildly. A volley of shots from the posse cut him down, fell in the doorway, his body becoming a threshold between the world he had terrorized and the justice that awaited his accomplices. The return fire from the cabin was sporadic, desperate. After a tense silence, Raymond Hamilton, Maybelle, and Boone Miller emerged, their hands raised, their faces pale with the realization that their reign was over. As they were led away, the members of the posse looked at them not with triumph, but with a cold, simmering hatred. The law had them, but for many, the law was too lenient, too slow. The captives were taken to the county jail in Henderson, a sturdy red brick building that stood as a symbol of order opposite the courthouse lawn. For 10 days, a crowd of locals gathered. The stories of Pemberton's torture, of Granny Hardy's screams, circulated and festered. The public fury became a living entity, fed by fear and a deep-seated desire for a final, quick, and bloody resolution. On the night of April 29th, the storm broke. A mob of 100 to 200 men, with their faces obscured, converged on the jail. They were not a rabble. They were a purposeful, silent army which carried sledgehammers and crowbars. They overwhelmed the sheriff and marched into the heart of the jail. They knew exactly who they wanted. They passed by Mabel's cell, recognizing that her punishment would be a life sentence of infamy. But they did find Raymond Hamilton and Boone Miller. The two men were dragged screaming and begging down the stairs and out into the cool night air. The courthouse lawn, a place meant to symbolize justice, was transformed into a theater of vengeance. 2 sturdy oak trees were chosen. Coarse ropes were thrown over the limbs. The nooses were tightened. In front of a silent, grim-faced crowd, the two men were hoisted into the air, their death throes illuminated by the headlights of parked cars. Their bodies twisted and turned, creating macabre shadows that danced on the courthouse walls. Photographs were taken, sold later as postcards. A gruesome souvenir of the night East Texas took its revenge. The lynching of the Raymond Hamilton did not bring peace. It brought a different kind of silence, heavy and shameful. It stands as one of the dark lynching incidents in American history.